or slammed doors, but as a kind of stillness that seeps into the floorboards and lingers in the corners of shared space. It wasn't that my husband stopped loving me, at least not in any conscious way. He was kind, generous, loyal. He held my hand at dinner parties, placed a hand on my back in social settings, and never forgot our anniversaries. But lately his presence had become procedural, as if he were following a list of what a good husband should do while something essential. Some flicker of recognition had dimmed in his eyes. I still loved him in the way one loves familiarity. Our marriage was built on structure, and there was a certain comfort in that rhythm. We rarely fought. He kissed my forehead every morning before work, and on Sundays we took long walks through the neighborhood discussing everything and nothing. But when I lay next to him at night beneath the cool expanse of our king-size bed, I felt like a ghost wrapped in flesh, untouched, unseen. We made love occasionally out of obligation more than desire, and afterward he'd turn on his side and drift into sleep while I stared at the ceiling, aching in places I couldn't name. The ache wasn't for passion alone, it was for being noticed in a way that couldn't be reduced to politeness or habit. I longed for someone to look at me like I was still a question, not an answer. Like I could still surprise them. That hunger didn't scream, it whispered. It settled in the curve of my spine when I bent to pick up a towel, in the way my fingers lingered on silk when folding laundry, and how long I took to choose a bra. Even though no one would see it, or so I thought. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, my husband's son from his first marriage. The housekeeper had prepared the guest room, and I had laid out fresh towels. I hadn't seen him in over a year. He'd been finishing grad school on the East Coast. When he stepped into the living room, dragging a suitcase behind him, I almost didn't recognize him. Taller, broader. His voice lower than I remembered. He had his father's jawline, but his presence felt entirely his own. He hugged me lightly, respectfully, and said it was good to see me. I told him the same. That evening, we ate on the patio. The air was heavy with June heat, and I wore a linen dress that clung slightly to my skin. He sat across from me. Sleeves rolled tan lines on his arms, a quiet confidence in the way he moved. My husband poured wine and talked about local politics, but I found myself stealing glances at the way his son held his glass, how he laughed deep, deliberate, not careless like most men his age. There was nothing inappropriate, but a sense of awareness settled between us like a pulse just beneath the surface. Later that night, I stood in our ensuite bathroom brushing my teeth, hair pulled up. The mirror showed a version of me I still hadn't accepted. Older, perhaps, but not less of a woman I had on a thin tank top and cotton shorts. Practical neutral. But I caught myself adjusting the strap twice, making sure it framed my collarbone. I told myself it was nothing. The next morning, I came down early to make coffee. I wasn't expecting anyone else to be awake, but as I opened the fridge, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly. He stood there in sweatpants and a plain black t-shirt, damp curls still clinging to his forehead from a shower. His eyes held for a second too long, not rude, not intrusive, just long enough to register something unspoken. "Didn't mean to startle you?" He said, "You didn't..." I replied, though my heartbeat betrayed me. I turned back to the counter, suddenly conscious of how exposed my bare shoulders were, how close he stood. The room was quiet, no music, no clatter, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the sound of two people pretending not to feel what they were starting to feel. Throughout the day, I caught myself paying attention to things I usually ignored. How often he smiled, the way he adjusted his sleeves, how he leaned slightly forward when speaking to me, never away. There was no flirting, no suggestion, just a tension building, like humidity before a storm. That evening, my husband fell asleep early in the living room, as he often did. I stayed on the patio, pretending to scroll through my phone. His son joined, me sitting a few chairs away. We talked about inconsequential things, films, city traffic, overpriced coffee. But every now and then, our eyes met, and something held. There was a moment when he reached for his drink and our fingers brushed. It lasted less than a second, but my breath caught. When I went upstairs to our bedroom, I undressed slowly. Not for anyone. Just for myself, I stood in front of the mirror in a soft beige bra and matching briefs, the kind I hadn't worn in months. I traced the strap over my shoulder and really felt my own skin. I slipped on a silk robe and sat on the edge of the bed. My husband stirred, mumbled something in his sleep, turned away. I couldn't sleep. I lay there, eyes open in the dark, listening to the occasional creak of the house. I thought about that brief look in the kitchen, the accidental brush of hands, the sound of his voice when he said my name. I wasn't fantasizing. I wasn't plotting, but something inside me had been touched, and once noticed it couldn't be undone. When the hallway light flickered under the door, I knew it was him heading to the bathroom, just the soft thud of feet on the carpet, and even though he didn't knock and I didn't rise, I felt more alive in that moment of silence than I had in a year of polite conversations and scheduled affection. I didn't move. I just let myself feel it. The impossible proximity of someone I should never see that way. But the next morning felt heavier, not with guilt, but with awareness. The house was the same sunlight pressing through the tall windows in the kitchen, the sound of the kettle beginning to boil. My husband humming, tunelessly as he poured his cereal, but my body moved differently. My skin was awake in a way I hadn't felt in years, like it remembered something before my mind could name it. I dressed with more thought than I usually gave to a quiet Saturday. Not overly deliberate, but I lingered over my choice of blouse, choosing one with a slightly lower neckline than usual. I paired it with soft jeans that clung just enough to trace the lines of my hips. Underneath, I wore lace pale, barely there fabric. I hadn't taken out of the drawer in months. I didn't tell myself why, I just did it. He came down later than the others, hair-tousled jaw shadowed with sleep. He nodded a greeting to me first, then his father. I watched how he took his coffee, no sugar, 2 spoons of cream, and how his eyes flicked up when I leaned slightly to open a cabinet. It wasn't a stare, it wasn't predatory, but it was present, and that alone ignited something low and burning in my stomach. My husband. Left shortly after breakfast for an impromptu trip to the city, some real estate meeting that couldn't be pushed. He kissed my cheek in a distracted way and asked if I needed anything from town. I shook my head. He told his son to make himself at home and was gone before the kettle finished whistling again. I stayed in the kitchen wiping counters that didn't need wiping. From the corner of my eye, I saw him return from the hallway. He stood in the doorway holding a book he must have found in the living room. Neither of us spoke for a moment. "Do you always clean things that are already clean?" he asked, a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. "Only when I don't want to think," I replied, setting the cloth down. Talked idly, leaning against opposite counters. The distance between us was just wide enough to feel deliberate. He asked about the book club I used to run. I asked why he had chosen not to stay in the city after school. The questions themselves didn't matter. It was the way we listened to each other fully openly, as if we were both aware this wasn't just small talk. I asked if he wanted to sit outside, and he nodded. We walked to the back patio, sunlight filtering through the pergola. Above, I brought out 2 glasses of wine early for the hour, but it felt appropriate. The warmth of the day clung to my bare arms, and as I sat, my knee brushed his for the briefest second. He didn't move away, and I didn't apologize. I could feel my pulse in places I wasn't used to noticing. The wine warmed my chest. Or maybe it was the nearness of him, how he leaned slightly closer than needed when he spoke. How he watched my lips as I answered. "You look different," he said. At one point, quiet. Not in a complimentary tone, but as an observation. "Different how?" He paused, took a sip of wine, and said nothing. That silence held more weight than anything else could have. I didn't press. We stayed outside longer than we intended. The sun began to dip, and the air took on a cooler edge. I stood to gather the glasses, and he reached out, fingertips grazing mine. Neither of us let go immediately. Later that evening, I changed into something softer, a slate gray dress that hung low on the back, falling just to the knees. I told myself I wanted to be comfortable. But when I passed the mirror, I adjusted the straps, smoothed the fabric along my hips. My body responded before my mind gave it permission. He was in the kitchen when I came down alone, pouring himself water. I stepped in to grab my phone from the island counter. He looked up. For a moment, neither of us moved. "You look really good," he said. And there was something about the way he said it, not rushed, not flirtatious, but slow measured, like he was giving himself permission to see me. "Thanks," I said, barely above a whisper. The distance between us narrowed. I reached for the phone, he reached for his glass. Our hands brushed. This time, neither of us looked away. There was no decision, no calculated move, just the quiet collapse of distance. His lips met mine like a question he already knew the answer to. There was no urgency, no fumbling, just a deliberate, aching softness. His hand found the curve of my waist, not possessively, but reverently. I responded without thinking, tilting my head, parting my lips, letting him in. The kiss was warm, unhurried, and complete in a way that startled me. When we pulled apart, I couldn't breathe properly. Not from shame, from shock. I had forgotten how it felt to be wanted like that. With intention. With stillness, he stepped back first. Eyes lowered, chest, rising and falling like he'd just come up for air. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to." "You did," I interrupted gently. "And so, did I?" We didn't speak after that. He went upstairs. I remained alone in the kitchen, fingers tracing the edge of the counter, lips still tingling. I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel panic. I felt alive, more than I had in years, upstairs. I heard his door click shut. I didn't follow, I didn't need to, because something had already been set in motion, and both of us knew it couldn't be undone. Tomorrow would still come, but tonight would echo. The day stretched on, suspended, in some quiet tension that I couldn't shake. The house felt like a stage set for a play where we all knew our roles but had somehow lost sight of the script. My husband returned late in the afternoon, and everything about him seemed just as it had before. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, and we settled into the familiar rhythm of dinner preparations, the clatter of pots and pans drowning out any remaining thoughts. He asked me how my day had been, and I responded as I always did, with a practiced smile, a casual mention of errands, a brief recounting of whatever little had occupied me. It was nothing new, but beneath the surface something was shifting inside me. The moment he walked through the door, his presence made everything feel ordinary. Too ordinary. I didn't want ordinary anymore. I wanted something that would make me feel seen, that would make me feel alive. I couldn't explain it, not even to myself. It was as though in the span of just a few hours, the air in this house had thickened, become saturated with something unspoken. The kiss I shared with his son lingered in my thoughts like a stubborn taste. I couldn't wash away. Later after dinner, my husband retreated to the study. As he often did after the day's demands, I cleaned up the kitchen, the soft hum of the dishwasher, the only sound in the house. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, and I realized I had been waiting for it all day, waiting for the next encounter, the next brush of his hand, the next look that made my heart race. I walked into the living room, my fingers trailing along the edge of the armchair as I passed it. The son was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone completely, absorbed in whatever he was reading. He didn't notice me at first, and I almost felt relieved. I didn't want him to see how much I had changed, how the anticipation in my body made me feel like I was walking on the edge of something. I had no intention of making any move. I wasn't even sure what I was hoping for. But I sat on the opposite end of the couch, close enough that the space between us felt deliberate, charged. He looked up after a while, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. It wasn't the first time, but this time felt different. There was a weight to it. Neither of us said anything, but I could feel his awareness of me, the shift in his demeanor. He sat up straighter, suddenly aware of the tension in the room. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. I wasn't even sure what I wanted from him. But it wasn't normal anymore. The air between us was thick with something unsaid, something undeniable. I could see it in his eyes, the way he was trying to figure out how to navigate the space between us, how to reconcile the distance he'd always maintained with the pull that seemed to grow stronger. He shifted, running a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. I wondered if he too was aware of how this moment felt so different from the others. How the subtle distance that had always existed between us had evaporated, leaving something else in its place. Something dangerous. Something thrilling. "You okay?" he asked, his voice casual but with an edge of curiosity that didn't match the lightness of the question. I nodded more to myself than to him. "Yeah, just thinking." I paused, unsure of how to explain what was happening inside me. How to explain this rush of awareness, this pull that felt like an unspoken invitation. It's just been a weird day, I guess. He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on mine for a fraction too long. The silence stretched between us, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for something I didn't know. What I didn't know how this would unfold. But it was as though the decision had already been made in some unspoken way. And now we were simply waiting for the inevitable. I stood up suddenly. Feeling the weight of my own indecision, I had no idea how I'd gotten here or why it felt so natural to be so close to him in this moment. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I knew that nothing would be the same after tonight. The space between us had already been crossed. There was no going back. I didn't realize how long I had been standing there until he shifted in his seat. I glanced down, catching his eye once more. There was something in his expression now, something raw, something that mirrored my own confusion and desire. He was waiting for me to make the next move, just as I was waiting for him. But instead of stepping forward, instead of taking the leap I thought I was ready for, I did the one thing I always did when I was uncertain. I pulled back. I turned toward the hallway, not looking back as I moved toward the stairs. My heart was pounding in my chest, the anticipation from earlier still alive in my veins. I had no idea what I was doing. All I knew was that the space I'd once carved out for comfort was now filled with a kind of fire I couldn't douse. I reached the top of the stairs, the quiet of the house enveloping me, and I stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of my own breath. Was I afraid? Or was I simply aware of how much I wanted what I couldn't have? I didn't know how to answer that. All I knew was that for the first time in a long while, I felt alive, and I couldn't stop the ache that came with that realization. The door to the guest room creaked open behind me, and I turned just in time to see him standing in the doorway. His presence filled the space between us, filling the silence with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Neither of us moved, but in that moment I felt everything shift once. Again. Nothing was the same anymore. The next morning arrived without fanfare. Sunlight slanted through the curtains in thin golden ribbons, touching the edge of the bed where my body had twisted and turned through the night. Sleep had been shallow, fragmented, and even as I stared at the ceiling, I wasn't sure whether I was more tired or simply consumed by thought. There was no clarity, no resolution, only a deeper kind of unrest. My husband's body lay heavy beside mine, his breath even, and undisturbed. I looked at him and saw the man I had built my life around. Reliable, predictable. His hand brushed my thigh in his sleep, a gentle, absent-minded gesture that used to comfort me. Now it barely registered as real touch. It felt like a placeholder, like the performance of connection, not connection itself. I lay there quietly watching the patterns on the ceiling, listening to the slow rhythm of morning, but inside me everything trembled. I got up before he stirred. A body moved with mechanical precision, brushing my teeth, selecting clothes, stepping into the soft light of the hallway. I didn't bother with makeup, but I chose a pale blouse that clung to my skin with a kind of whisper, a reminder of what it felt like to be aware of my own body. Underneath lace again, white this time. There was no intention. Or maybe there was. But I told myself otherwise. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of toast and coffee. The son was already at the table scrolling through something on his phone. His face was calm, almost blank, but when he looked up and saw me, his eyes shifted. Just slightly enough for me to feel it in my stomach. We greeted each other like nothing had happened. Like the air between us hadn't thickened with electricity the night before. Like I hadn't stood in the dark, listening for the sound of his door closing, thinking about crossing the hallway and what it would mean to knock. My husband joined us a few minutes later. And suddenly, we were just a family, at breakfast again. Toast buttered mugs, filled headlines discussed. I played my part. We all did. But beneath the words, my mind kept circling the same loop. What happens when the boundary? We never thought. We'd approach starts to feel like the only real thing. Later that day, my husband suggested we go away. A weekend trip. Just the two of us. We haven't had real time together in months. He said, no distractions, just you and me. Let's drive up to the coast. I smiled, nodded agreed. But inside something hollow opened up. I should have felt relief. I should have taken it as a sign that he still cared, that we could still reach for each other. But all I could think about was how late this invitation felt, how mechanical it sounded. I watched him as he stood by the sink rinsing his plate, the light hitting the silver strands in his hair. He was trying, I knew that. But the chasm between us no longer felt like something a weekend could fix. That evening, I found myself alone in the guest bedroom. The excuse was simple. I had been cleaning folding towels, refreshing linens. But when I stood in the center of the room surrounded by the faint scent of his cologne and the barely disturbed order of his belongings, I didn't move. I just stood there, breathing him in. There was a stillness to the space, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy. With him, I sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on my lap. I didn't know why I was there. Or maybe I did. Maybe I was looking for a trace of that moment we shared, a scent, a sound, a piece of something left behind. My fingers trailed across the comforter and I imagined his body stretched out. Across it, the shape of his shoulders beneath the sheets. My own body reacted before I gave it permission to a throb, a tightening. I told myself to leave, to get up, walk away. Pretend this moment never happened. But I stayed, because something about that room felt more real than any other part of the house. I didn't hear him approach. The door hadn't been locked, and when it creaked open behind me, I froze. I didn't turn. He didn't speak. I was looking for my charger. He said finally. His voice was quiet, almost uncertain. I turned slowly, meeting his gaze. We stared at each other across a few feet of carpet and 1,000 unspoken things. The air between us buzzed with a tension that had become a living thing. I stood, "It's on the nightstand," I said. He stepped in, picked it up, but didn't turn to leave. Instead, he glanced at the bed, then back at me. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know." I replied. And for a moment, neither of us moved. He stood closer now, closer than was appropriate, but not enough to touch. Just enough that I could feel the heat of him. I looked at his mouth, then back to his eyes. He stepped back just slightly, and I could see it. He was fighting it. Just like I was, I wanted to say something, anything. But the words caught in my throat. I nodded, turned to the door, and walked out. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding in my ears. I didn't know if I had just made the right choice or the worst mistake. Back in my own bedroom, I found my husband asleep on the bed, laptop still open beside him. I climbed in quietly, careful not to wake him. But I couldn't sleep. My skin felt too tight. My thoughts too loud. I lay there staring at the ceiling again, listening to the silence of the house. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But I knew I wasn't done. Not yet. The weather turned overnight. Morning brought a chill to the windows and a layer of condensation that blurred the world outside. I sat at the edge of the bed, wrapped in a thick robe, watching the pale light crawl over the floorboards. My husband was already downstairs. His footsteps and the sound of the espresso machine floated faintly upward, but I didn't move. I waited, letting the robe slip off one shoulder, feeling the air touch my skin. My fingers rested, lightly on my collarbone, tracing the slow rhythm of my pulse. I had dreamed about him, about the sun. Not in vivid cinematic ways, but in flashes, his hand grazing mine, the weight of his gaze, the tension in his jaw as he stood inches away and didn't move. In the dream, we didn't kiss, but we didn't need to. The nearness was enough. I woke up with my thighs clenched and my heart tight in my chest. There was no denying it anymore. I wanted him downstairs. The rhythm of the house resumed. My husband sipped his coffee, reading from his laptop, while I buttered toast in silence. The son entered a few minutes later, hair damp from the shower, his t-shirt clinging slightly at the neckline. He greeted us with a nod, reached for a mug, and poured himself coffee. I didn't look at him. Not directly. But I felt it, that same hum under my skin, the familiar tightening of my stomach when he stood too close. We spoke little. The usual fragments of morning dialogue passed between us like background noise. What's the plan for the day? Should we pick up groceries? Do you want to go for a walk later? But it all felt like scaffolding, holding up something far more unstable beneath. Each glance carried weight. Each silence stretched longer than necessary. By early afternoon, my husband left again, some unexpected call at the office, another urgent meeting that couldn't be done remotely. He promised to be back by dinner. I kissed him goodbye at the door, as I always did. He smiled, brushed my cheek with his fingers, and walked out, briefcase in hand. The door closed behind him, and the house exhaled. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was saturated, as if every surface remembered the last time we were alone. I went upstairs without thinking, my body moving faster than my logic. In the bedroom, I opened the drawer where I kept things. I rarely wore garments saved for anniversaries, forgotten nights that never turned into what I hoped they would. I took out a navy slip, delicate, soft, with thin straps and a low back. It didn't scream intention. It whispered it. I didn't rush. I let myself feel everything. The weight of the fabric against my skin. The way my hands trembled as I brushed my hair back. I wore perfume. Just a trace. When I came downstairs, he was in the living room, curled into the corner of the couch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up and froze. The look in his eyes said everything. Wasn't lust. It was confusion, recognition, restraint, battling something stronger. I stepped into the room slowly. Not a performance, not seduction, just a presence. His eyes followed me as I crossed to the sideboard, pretending to adjust a photo frame. I felt the heat rise up my neck. I knew I was doing something irreversible. I thought you were upstairs. He said finally, his voice low, rough. I turned to face him, leaning slightly against the furniture. I just wanted a glass of water. He stood too quickly, setting his phone aside, moving toward the kitchen. I'll get it. I followed. The kitchen was bright with early winter light, the countertops clean, the hum of the fridge, the only sound. He poured the water, set the glass down. I moved closer. Can you zip this? I asked quietly, turning my back to him. My voice didn't shake, but my breath did. He hesitated. I felt it in the silence. Then his hand touched the base of my spine, finding the zipper. His fingers were warm, careful. He lifted it slowly, the sound small but deafening. When he reached the top, he let his hand rest there, just below the nape of my neck. I didn't move. Turned slowly, catching his eyes. We didn't speak. He stepped forward. His hand found my jaw, hesitant but certain. His mouth met mine, not abruptly, but with aching intention. This time it wasn't delicate. It was weight and warmth and the quiet collapse of every line we'd tried to draw. My hands curled into his shirt, his fingers pressed into the small of my back. The kiss deepened, and for a moment the world disappeared. There was only breath-touch heat. Then we heard it, the unmistakable click of the front door. We broke apart like glass. He stepped back, lips parted, eyes wide. I grabbed a cardigan from the chair, pulling it around myself. Heart racing like thunder beneath my skin, footsteps. A bag set down. My husband calling out, something about traffic. The son turned away, hands clenched at his sides. I stood frozen, chest rising and falling, the taste of him still on my lips. I stepped forward, brushing his shoulder lightly. Just once, just enough. That night in bed, my husband curled into me, his breath warm against my neck. His hand moved slowly down my hip, and I didn't flinch. I let him touch me. Let him believe I was there. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift to the kitchen, to the warmth of hands that were not his, to the weight of a kiss that still lingered in the space between my ribs. And later, when he slept, I turned onto my back and stared at the ceiling. I wasn't afraid of what I'd done. I was afraid of how much I wanted it again. Following days unfolded with an eerie stillness, like the surface of water just before the storm breaks through. Nothing visible had changed. We woke dressed, spoke dined as always, but everything beneath had shifted irreversibly. My husband, perhaps unknowingly, began to lean into gestures that once would have touched me. A hand on the small of my back, a light kiss before leaving the house, a compliment about the color of my blouse. It was subtle, but I noticed, or maybe I wanted to believe he noticed something, sensed a change, that his instincts, dulled by years of comfort, had been stirred awake by something he couldn't name, yet even in his warmth, I felt a growing distance. Not physical, not even emotional perhaps, but spiritual. He was reaching for a version of me that had quietly eroded over time. He loved the woman who hosted dinner parties with poise, who asked about quarterly reports, who planned vacations 6 months ahead. But that woman was no longer me. She had been replaced slowly, invisibly, by someone whose skin remembered the shape of a forbidden hand, whose breath still caught at the memory of a kiss that hadn't been gentle. I began to take long walks in the afternoons alone, I told him I needed the fresh air, that it helped clear my head. That part was true. But what I didn't say was that I was trying to make sense of what was happening inside me. I didn't recognize my own thoughts anymore. I found myself walking longer, circling blocks I had never noticed, passing playgrounds, cafes, churches. I watched strangers, couples, children, dog walkers, ordinary lives in motion, and I wondered in a kind of quiet panic if I had just ruined the only ordinary life I'd ever built. One afternoon, I wandered into a park bench hidden beneath a canopy of trees removed from the path. I sat there watching sunlight filter through the leaves, a quiet wind brushing over my legs. I felt untethered, not lost, but floating just slightly above my own life. I folded my hands in my lap and stared ahead, trying to remember the last time I had felt grounded, the last time I had belonged entirely to one world. The sound of footsteps approached from behind, unhurried, heavy, familiar. I didn't need to turn, I knew it was him. He sat beside me without speaking. Our bodies didn't touch, but the proximity was enough to jolt my senses awake. His presence pressed against the side of me like a memory being relived. In real time, I didn't follow you, he said quietly after a while. I was already out walking. I didn't say anything. I replied, you didn't have to. I could feel him looking at me, but I didn't return the gaze. My eyes stayed fixed on a spot ahead, a child kicking a soccer ball across an empty patch of grass. We sat like that for several minutes, suspended between truths we weren't ready to speak aloud. I've been trying to give you space, he said finally. No, I'm not sure it helps. I turned to look at him then, and in that moment something shifted. He wasn't composed, he wasn't carefully distant. His expression was raw, not lust, not guilt, just uncertainty. The same look I had seen in the mirror every day since it started. I wondered if he was as confused as I was, if the ache he carried had its own weight and logic and shape. I don't know what we're doing, I admitted. I just know I can't stop thinking about it. Me neither. His words sat between us unvarnished. We didn't touch, we didn't lean into each other, but everything in that silence felt heavier than skin. When we stood, we didn't walk back together. I let him go first. I needed a few more minutes to steady my breathing, to count my thoughts like loose change. The walk home was slow, my legs heavy with the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from movement but from restraint. That night, my husband brought home my favorite wine. He cooked something he hadn't done in years without prompting and set the table with real napkins. I watched him as he moved through the kitchen. His shirt sleeves rolled, the scent of rosemary clinging to his hands. He smiled more than usual, asked about my day, poured the wine before I had the chance to lift the bottle. And I felt nothing. Not disdain, Not contempt, but a chilling indifference. Like watching a play I had memorized line for line, I responded with practiced ease, laughed where appropriate, complimented the lamb, drank slowly. He reached across the table at one point, brushing his fingers over mine. I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in either. That night in bed, he touched me again, with more intention than usual. His hands trailed down my sides. His mouth searched my shoulder. I closed my eyes and let him move. Let him believe that the silence meant consent. But my mind wandered elsewhere. I remembered a different hand. A breath caught just before a kiss. A tension that vibrated like a string pulled too tight, and I hated myself for it. For the betrayal my body committed while my conscience screamed warnings I couldn't obey when it was over. He curled into me, satisfied, and whispered something soft about missing us. I stayed awake long after his breathing steadied. My body still tingled, but not from what had just happened. From what hadn't. The next morning, I told him I needed space. Not a divorce. Not a fight. Just space. A weekend, maybe. To visit my sister, to clear my head. He looked at me confused, maybe a little hurt, but he didn't protest. He nodded, took a sip of his coffee, and said he'd make sure the house was fine in my absence. I didn't pack much. Just enough for 2 nights, but I didn't go to my sister's. I booked a small room by the coast, a quiet hotel I'd always driven past, but never entered. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. When I checked in, I stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the gray sea beyond the dunes. The air was cold, brainy, full of silence. I sat on the bed and pulled my knees to my chest. I didn't feel free. I just felt ready for something I still couldn't name. The hotel room smelled of sea salt and polished wood, the kind of clean that feels curated, impersonal, but comforting in its simplicity. It overlooked a stretch of windswept coastline where the sky seemed always on the edge of storm. I didn't open my suitcase for hours. I didn't turn on the television or check my phone. I sat by the window in silence, watching the tide crawl in and out like a breath. The earth was too tired to hold. It was the first time in years that I had truly been alone. Not just physically, but free from the performative scaffolding of marriage, motherhood, social expectations. I wasn't a wife in this room. I wasn't a hostess, a neighbor, or a woman preserving the quiet dignity of a family's image. I was just me, bare, unspoken, unaccounted for. And it terrified me, because I no longer knew what that meant. That evening I showered slowly, methodically. The water was hot, almost punishing, and I let it hit the back of my neck until the muscles loosened. I shaved, exfoliated, brushed my skin until it turned pink, as if scrubbing away guilt would make me clean again. I stepped out and wrapped myself in a thick towel, pausing in front of the mirror. My reflection looked softer in the hotel's flattering lighting, still older, still tired, but undeniably present. Real and alive in a way that I hadn't seen in a long time. I chose lingerie. Hadn't worn in over a year. A deep burgundy set with fine lace detailing and satin straps that kissed the skin rather than clung to it. It wasn't for anyone but me. I slipped it on slowly, breathing through each clasp, watching the way my body responded to the ritual. It wasn't vanity, it was reclamation. Then I dressed in a long charcoal sweater, just enough to hide the intimacy underneath, but not enough to forget it was there. I let my hair dry, naturally curling slightly at the ends, and applied the faintest touch of lip color. No earrings, no perfume. I didn't want to be dramatic. I wanted to be seen. By the time I heard the knock on the door, my hands were cold from waiting. I hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of the finality of the moment. Because whatever would happen next, it would draw a permanent line between the woman I had been and the one I was becoming. I opened the door. He stood there with his hands in the pockets of his coat, a faint pink on, his cheeks from the cold hair tousled by the wind. He didn't smile, he didn't speak, but his eyes moved over me slowly, deliberately, and something inside me stirred with such force that I had to grip the edge of the door to stay upright. Stepped aside, and he walked in. He moved with the kind of hesitation that belongs to people who know they are doing something irreversible. The silence between us was dense. He took off his coat and placed it gently over the chair. careful not to make noise. Then he turned to me. I wasn't sure you'd actually come. He said, his voice rough at the edges. I wasn't sure I would either. He nodded, looking down for a moment, then back up. You look different. No, I said quietly. This is exactly how I've always looked. You just never saw me before. His throat tightened. I could see it. He didn't respond. I moved to the window, needing to anchor myself to something. The sea outside was restless, dark, and magnificent. I felt him come up behind me, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his body. I don't know how to do this, he said finally. I don't know how to be near you and not touch you. I turned, then slowly, my chest nearly brushing his. Then don't. The moment hung between us, fragile and trembling. But he didn't move, and neither did I, because in that moment we both understood something. The wanting was no longer the problem. It was the waiting. He brushed a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers barely grazing my cheek. The touch made my spine straighten, my breath hitch. I closed my eyes. There was no rush, no frantic fumbling, just the slow, deliberate collapse of space. He didn't kiss me, not yet. He just stood there, one hand lightly resting on my waist, the other by his side, as if afraid that even one gesture too bold might undo me. I thought I could stop. He whispered, so did I. I answered. We stood like that for minutes, the silence dense with restraint, with memory, with the unspoken fear that this was a kind of love we weren't allowed to name. My chest ached from holding everything in, and then he leaned in. Not for my lips, but for my shoulder, his face resting there, his breath shallow against my skin. It was the most intimate thing I had felt in years. Not sexual, not romantic, just deeply, devastatingly human. We stayed that way until the light outside began to fade. We didn't undress, we didn't cross every line. But something much more dangerous happened. We no longer wanted to go back. When he finally left quietly, without a promise, I stood in the doorway and watched him disappear down the hallway, and I knew without needing to say it that everything from this point forward would be lived in the space between what was right and what was real. The morning after he left, I didn't open the curtains right away. I lay in bed under the hotel's heavy linens, eyes fixed on the ceiling, heart slow but restless. There was no hangover of regret, no overwhelming guilt pressing against my ribs. What lingered instead was a kind of fullness I hadn't felt in years. Something quiet, something private. Like the way your body remembers the warmth of sun long after stepping inside. I moved slowly, letting the cool air of the room wake me. In the bathroom mirror, my reflection didn't look transformed. It wasn't that I looked more beautiful or younger or braver, but I looked present. My face held something softer in the mouth, sharper in the eyes, a kind of readiness that came not from anticipation, but from realization. I took my time dressing. A soft gray turtleneck, simple black slacks. No lingerie today, not the kind that whispered seduction. At least I needed to feel grounded again, to reconnect with the version of myself that could still walk among people, answer questions, pay for coffee without trembling. The lobby was quiet. I passed a couple checking in their luggage, squeaking behind them. The woman adjusting the strap of her purse as she laughed at something he whispered. It should have made me feel something. Jealousy, perhaps. Longing. But I felt detached from their world, as if I had stepped too far from the shore of my own life to ever return the same. I ordered coffee from the small cafe attached to the hotel, then sat at a table by the window with a notebook I hadn't opened. In months, I used to write more often. Nothing ambitious, just thoughts, fragments, questions. I opened it now and stared at the blank page. The pen felt foreign in my hand, like holding onto something I used to believe in. I didn't know what. To write? Not yet. But I sat there anyway, watching the ocean move under a washed-out sky, letting the ache of the night before settle deep inside my bones. Later, I checked out without speaking more than necessary. The receptionist asked if everything had been satisfactory. I smiled and nodded. There was nothing in their eyes that suggested they suspected what this trip had meant. It was a relief to be anonymous. Driving home was harder than I thought. Every highway exit, every familiar billboard, every stretch of trees along the interstate felt like a slow unraveling of whatever fragile certainty I had stitched together during my time away. I wanted to turn back. Not to the hotel, but to the feeling I had carried there. The one where I was allowed to be undefined, untouched by my role, my title, my quiet, polite betrayal. When I pulled into our driveway, the sun had already begun to dip. The house looked exactly as I had left it. Lights on in the kitchen. My husband's car. In its place, nothing broken, nothing visibly wrong, which somehow made it harder. Inside, the warmth of familiarity hit me like a gust of stale air. He greeted me with that same practiced kiss on the cheek, arms wrapping lightly around my shoulders as he took my bag. He asked how my sister was. I answered smoothly without a pause. I was surprised by how easy the lie came. How convincingly my voice held. We ate together that night. He talked about a colleague who had resigned unexpectedly, the chaos it created in the office. I listened, nodding, even laughing once, at something mildly absurd he shared. He didn't notice the way I kept my hand close to my chest, the way I avoided eye contact just enough not to be rude, but the hardest part was how much he tried. He brought up the idea of taking that postponed trip, the one we've always talked about. He asked if I'd looked into new restaurants I wanted to try. He offered to take Friday off, and I smiled. I thanked him. I said it sounded lovely, but every offer, every warm gesture struck a deeper chord of sadness. Because I realized he was trying not to save me, but to save what he thought we still were. He didn't sense that I had already left, partially quietly, invisibly. That night in bed, I lay awake again. This time, he was the one who reached for me first. His hands were gentle, deliberate. He kissed my neck, whispered something I couldn't fully hear but recognized as affectionate. I responded out of habit, out of guilt, out of something far more complicated than love, and as he moved over me, careful and tender, I kept my eyes on the ceiling, letting him believe that this was closeness. But my body didn't hum for him. My mind didn't drift with desire. It stayed grounded in memory. In contrast, I remembered the way the sun had touched me without touching. The way he had stood close without claiming. The way his silence had wrapped around me with more honesty than any word my husband had spoken in months. Afterwards, when my husband kissed my shoulder and drifted into sleep, I rolled onto my back, pulling the sheets to my chest. The room was quiet, peaceful, but I felt none of it. Because it wasn't betrayal that haunted me. It was the clarity, the irrefutable knowledge that I had already crossed, a line I would never uncross. Not because I had kissed someone else, but because I no longer belonged in this marriage. And worse, I didn't want to. Some betrayals unfold like storms, loud, abrupt, destructive. Others seep in slowly, silently, like water, through a crack in the wall unnoticed until the damage is already beyond repair. Mine belonged to the second kind. No raised voices, no accusations, just the slow erosion of what once felt unshakable until all that remained was the structure, hollowed from within. A week passed. Then, too, life on the surface resumed its patterns. I cooked. He worked. We smiled where appropriate, touched when expected, answered questions from friends and family with the kind of ease that comes from years of practiced choreography. But something vital had gone missing in both of us, and the silence between our conversations began to feel less like comfort and more like avoidance. I no longer searched for meaning in our moments. I didn't try to rebuild the intimacy I once craved. Instead, I let the distance settle, quietly, permanently, like a new layer of paint over a cracked wall. And then one night the crack opened. It was late. The house was dark except for the hallway light, left on by habit. I was in the laundry room folding towels when I heard the door of the guest bedroom creak open. My breath caught. I paused, towel half folded in my hands. Then came the footsteps, slow, uncertain. I didn't move until he stepped into the doorway. Not my husband. Him. He stood there for a moment, neither entering fully nor retreating, as if waiting for me to set the terms of this encounter. I wasn't sure if I should come he said quietly. You're already here. I answered, not looking at him. He hesitated. Then, stepping into the room, he leaned against the dryer, arms crossed. We stood in silence, surrounded by the faint scent of detergent and steam. There was no seduction in the air, no heat, only the weight of everything we hadn't said. I'm leaving. He said finally, I got the job, out of state. I start in 3 weeks. I nodded slowly, absorbing the words, congratulations. That's not why I came to tell you. My eyes met his then. There was something unsteady in his expression. Regret maybe, or fear. I couldn't go without seeing you again. Without... He broke off, then tried again. You changed. Something in me. I didn't respond immediately. My throat was tight, but my chest was steady. I changed something in myself. I said, you just woke it up. He took a step closer, cautiously. His voice dropped lower. If things were different, but they're not. I cut in, not harshly, but final. And I don't know if I'd want them to be. He stood very still, and for a moment I wanted him to reach for me again, to say something that would make this decision disappear. But he didn't. He simply looked at me, eyes holding something quiet and breaking. Then he nodded. I'm sorry, he whispered. So am I. He turned and walked away. That was the last time I saw him, not because of scandal or choice. Or revenge. But because life, when it breaks, doesn't always shatter. It crumbles slowly, particle by particle, until nothing fits together. The same way again. Few days later, I found my husband sitting at the kitchen table with my phone in. His hands. He wasn't angry, he wasn't yelling, he was quiet, and that was worse. He didn't ask a question, he just showed me the screen. One message, a brief exchange, nothing explicit, but too personal, too tender. I found this by accident. He said, I wasn't looking. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. I had nothing rehearsed, nothing to soften what he already knew. I'm not asking for details. He continued, I'm asking if it's over. I wanted to say yes, I wanted to say no. But the truth was more complicated than either. It was never about leaving you. I said, he didn't look at me, but you already did. And that was the moment it broke. Not the marriage that would come later in the cold formality of paperwork and separation agreements. What broke in that moment was the illusion that love, long-term, loyal, well-intentioned love, could survive without being fed. That a house, even a beautiful one, could be a home without warmth. That night, I didn't sleep beside him. I stayed in the guest room. I lay in the bed, where the scent of him still faintly lingered, eyes wide open in the dark. Not crying, not mourning, just breathing. Slowly. Quietly, when morning came, I packed a small bag. No ceremony, no goodbyes. I left him a note, polite, apologetic, careful. I didn't explain everything, I didn't name names. I just told the truth as I could bear it, that I needed to find myself again, that I didn't know where I lost. Her that maybe somehow I had never really been found. I closed the door behind me, walked to the car, and started the engine. The house shrank in the rearview mirror as I drove away into a morning that looked just like every other but felt like the beginning of something completely different, and in the quiet for the first time in months, I exhaled.
Bye.